The teacup shattered on the marble floor, and every head in the room turned at once. Alina froze, her hand still trembling from the sudden movement beside her. She had not dropped it. The Duke had reached for it at the exact moment she poured, his fingers brushing hers, and the porcelain had slipped from both their grasps together. For one long second, nobody spoke. Then Lady Ashworth's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Alina, clean this at once." The command was sharp, meant to remind everyone in the room exactly where Alina stood. She was not a guest. She was not family. She was the girl who served tea and swept floors, the poor relation nobody wanted to claim as their own. Alina dropped to her knees immediately, gathering the broken pieces with quick, practiced hands, her cheeks burning with humiliation. But Duke Sebastian Rexford did something nobody expected. He knelt down beside her. "Allow me," he said quietly, picking up a shard of porcelain and placing it in her palm. His eyes met hers for only a moment, but that moment stretched long enough for three sisters, a mother and half the noble families of the county to notice. Camille's smile faltered. Delphine's fan stopped moving. Rosalind, the youngest and most beautiful of the three, felt her stomach drop. This was supposed to be their day, their moment, the day one of them would become a duchess. 3 months earlier, when the invitation arrived at the Ashworth estate, the household had erupted into celebration. Duke Sebastian Rexford, one of the wealthiest and most eligible men in the entire region, had requested a formal introduction to the Ashworth daughters. Lady Ashworth had wept with joy, already imagining the wedding, the title, the doors that would open for her family once a Rexford married into it. The sisters had spent weeks preparing. Camille studied literature and politics late into the night, determined to impress the Duke with her intelligence. She practiced her posture in front of mirrors, corrected the angle of her chin, rehearsed clever remarks about poetry and philosophy that she hoped would make her seem worldly and sharp. Delphine, the middle sister, took a different approach. She was known throughout the county for her charm and her laughter, the kind of woman who could fill a room with warmth simply by walking into it. She spent her preparation time perfecting stories, jokes, and small dramatic mishaps that always seemed to work in her favor, drawing attention and sympathy in equal measure. Rosalind needed no preparation at all, or so everyone believed. She was, without question, the most beautiful woman in the county, with golden hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. Suitors had lined up for her attention since she turned 16. She assumed, as did everyone around her, that the Duke would take one look at her, and the matter would be settled. None of them noticed Alina. Alina had lived with the Ashworth family since she was 11 years old, after her parents died in a fire that destroyed everything they owned. Lady Ashworth, technically Alina's aunt through a distant marriage, had taken her in out of obligation rather than love. There was no adoption, no formal place in the family. Alina was given a small room near the kitchen, simple clothes, and a long list of daily duties. She served tea. She mended linens. She stayed quiet, stayed small, and tried not to draw attention to herself, because attention had only ever brought her trouble in that house. On the morning of the Duke's visit, Alina was told to help prepare the drawing room and then remain in the background, serving refreshments when needed and otherwise staying out of sight. She did not mind. She had long ago stopped imagining a different life for herself. Dreams were expensive, and she could not afford them. When Duke Sebastian Rexford arrived, the entire household lined up to greet him. He was tall, with dark hair and an unreadable expression, the kind of man who seemed to be studying everything and revealing nothing. He greeted Lady Ashworth with practiced courtesy, then turned his attention to the three sisters, who curtsied in perfect unison, a display they had rehearsed for days. "Your Grace," Camille said, straightening with poise, "we are honored by your visit. I do hope the roads were kind to you on your journey." "They were tolerable," the Duke replied, his tone polite but distant. Delphine stepped forward with a bright laugh. "Tolerable is a very serious word for such a fine morning, Your Grace. Perhaps we can find something to make your visit more than tolerable." The Duke offered a small, obligatory smile, the kind reserved for strangers whose company one endures rather than enjoys. Rosalind, confident in her beauty, simply lowered her eyes and let her golden hair catch the light from the window behind her, a practiced pose that had won her admiration from countless men before him. The Duke glanced at her, nodded once, and said nothing at all. The group moved into the drawing room where refreshments had been arranged. This was when Alina entered, carrying a silver tray with a teapot and delicate cups, moving quietly along the edge of the room as she had been trained to do. She did not look at the guests. She did not speak unless spoken to. She simply poured the tea, cup by cup, her movements smooth and unhurried, the product of years of practice in staying invisible. It was Sebastian who broke the pattern. While Camille discussed a recent essay on governance and Delphine told an animated story about a horse race gone wrong, the Duke's eyes drifted, almost against his will, toward the quiet woman standing near the window. She wore a plain gray dress, nothing like the silk and lace draped over the sisters. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, without a single jewel or ornament. And yet there was something about the way she moved, calm and unhurried, entirely present without demanding to be noticed, that pulled his attention away from the conversation happening directly in front of him. "Forgive me," he said, interrupting Camille mid-sentence. "Who is that young woman by the window?" The room went still. Lady Ashworth's smile tightened. "That is Alina, Your Grace, a distant relation. She helps with small duties around the house." "Does she not join the family for gatherings such as this?" "She prefers to remain useful," Lady Ashworth said quickly, the words clipped and final, a clear signal that the subject was closed. But Sebastian did not let it go so easily. "I would like a cup of tea from her hands, if that is permitted." It was an unusual request, perhaps even an improper one, but nobody in the room dared refuse a duke. Lady Ashworth gestured stiffly toward Alina, who approached with the teapot, her heart pounding though her face remained calm. She poured his tea carefully, aware of every eye in the room watching her. "Thank you," Sebastian said softly, his gaze lingering on her face for just a moment too long. "You are welcome, Your Grace," Alina replied, her voice steady despite the nervousness churning inside her. She turned to leave, eager to disappear back into the background where she belonged. "Wait," he said. She stopped, startled, and turned back to face him. The three sisters watched with growing unease as the Duke asked Alina a simple question about the garden visible through the window, whether the roses bloomed early that year. It was such an ordinary question, yet the way he asked it, with genuine curiosity rather than obligation, felt entirely different from the polished conversation he had offered the sisters moments before. Alina answered honestly, describing how she tended the garden herself in the early mornings before her other duties began, how the roses had bloomed nearly 2 weeks early due to the mild spring. She spoke without pretension, without trying to impress him, simply answering the question she had been asked. And somehow, that honesty seemed to hold his attention more completely than anything the sisters had said all afternoon. This was when the teacup fell. Sebastian had reached out, perhaps to gesture toward the window, perhaps for some reason even he could not fully explain, and his hand had brushed against Alina's just as she reached to refill his cup. The porcelain slipped, shattered, and the room's careful, polished atmosphere cracked along with it. Now, kneeling on the floor together, gathering broken pieces of china, Sebastian looked at Alina in a way that made the sisters' carefully rehearsed performances feel suddenly meaningless. "I am sorry for the trouble," Alina whispered, gathering the last shard. "There is no trouble," Sebastian said. "Only an accident. Accidents happen to everyone, regardless of their place in a room." There was something in the way he said it, regardless of their place in a room, that made Alina look up and meet his eyes fully for the first time. And what she saw there was not pity, not the polite indifference of a nobleman toward a servant. It was genuine interest, quiet and unmistakable. She looked away first, rising quickly and excusing herself to fetch a new cup, her hand still trembling as she disappeared through the door toward the kitchen. Behind her, the drawing room remained silent for a beat too long before Camille cleared her throat and attempted to steer the conversation back toward safer territory. But it was too late. Something had shifted in that room, and everyone present, whether they wanted to admit it or not, had felt it happen. Lady Ashworth watched the Duke's eyes track Alina's retreating figure until the door closed behind her, and a cold, sinking feeling settled into her chest. She had spent 3 months planning this visit, calculating every detail, choosing which sister would sit where, what topics would be discussed, how the light would fall through the windows to best flatter her daughters. She had not planned for this. She had not planned for the quiet girl by the window to become the only thing in the room the Duke seemed to see. The visit continued for another hour, filled with strained conversation and forced laughter. Camille tried again to engage Sebastian with talk of politics, hoping to recapture his attention through intellect. Delphine attempted another story, louder and more animated than before, desperate to fill the silence that kept threatening to return. Rosalind said very little, watching the door Alina had disappeared through with narrowed eyes, calculating what this meant for her own future. Sebastian remained polite throughout, answering questions, offering the occasional compliment, playing the role expected of him. But his attention had shifted, subtly and irrevocably, and every person in that room knew it, even if none of them dared speak the truth aloud. When Alina returned with a fresh cup, moving quietly to refill the Duke's tea one final time before the visit concluded, she kept her eyes lowered, determined not to repeat whatever had happened before. But as she poured, she felt his gaze on her again, steady and unmistakable, and her hands, usually so sure and practiced, trembled just slightly. "Thank you, Alina," Sebastian said, using her name for the second time that day, a small gesture that carried far more weight than either of them could have predicted. She nodded, unable to find words, and retreated once more to the edge of the room, wishing desperately that she could disappear entirely. As the Duke prepared to leave, Lady Ashworth walked him to the door, her voice bright and hopeful as she spoke of future visits, of dinners and gatherings where he might come to know her daughters better. Sebastian listened politely, nodding at the appropriate moments, offering vague agreements that satisfied Lady Ashworth enough to send her back inside with renewed optimism. But as he climbed into his carriage, he glanced back once toward the house, toward the small window near the kitchen where he knew, without quite knowing how he knew, that Alina would be watching. She was. She stood just behind the curtain, hidden from view, watching the carriage pull away down the long gravel drive. Her heart pounded in a way she did not understand and could not explain. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not fall for servants. Men of his station married women like Camille, Delphine, or Rosalind, women with titles and dowries and family names worth attaching to their own. Alina was none of those things. She was simply a girl who poured tea and tended roses, grateful for a roof over her head and nothing more. And yet, as the carriage disappeared around the bend, she found herself replaying the moment his eyes had met hers, the sound of his voice saying her name, the strange warmth that had spread through her chest when he knelt beside her on the floor. Inside the house, the three sisters gathered in Camille's room, the door shut firmly behind them. For a long moment, none of them spoke, each lost in her own private disappointment and confusion. Finally, Rosalind broke the silence. "Did you see the way he looked at her?" "I saw," Camille said quietly, her voice tight with something between anger and disbelief. "It means nothing," Delphine said, though her voice lacked conviction. "He is a duke, she is nothing, a servant, it cannot mean anything." But even as she said it, a small, uneasy doubt had already taken root in each of their minds, a doubt that would only grow stronger in the days and weeks to come. Because in the quiet moments after that first visit, None of the sisters could shake the memory of how completely the Duke's attention had shifted the instant Alina entered the room, how effortlessly she had captured something none of them, despite all their careful preparation, had managed to hold. That night, long after the house had gone silent, and the sisters had retreated to their separate rooms to nurse their separate wounds, Alina sat alone by her small window, staring out at the dark garden below. She thought of the roses she tended each morning, of the quiet life she had built for herself within the narrow boundaries she had been given. She did not allow herself to hope. Hope, she had learned long ago, was a dangerous thing for a girl in her position. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, she could not stop thinking about the way Sebastian had knelt beside her on the floor gathering broken pieces of porcelain, and told her that accidents happen to everyone, regardless of their place in a room. She did not yet know that this single afternoon had already set something in motion that neither she nor anyone else in that house would be able to stop. A letter arrived at the Ashworth estate exactly 9 days later, and it changed everything. Lady Ashworth tore it open at the breakfast table, her hands shaking with anticipation as she scanned the elegant handwriting. It was from Duke Sebastian Rexford, requesting permission to return for a second visit, this time to walk the estate gardens with the family. Lady Ashworth read the letter twice, then a third time, searching for any clue as to which sister he intended to favor. There was none. The letter simply stated his intention to visit the following week and expressed his appreciation for the family's hospitality. "He is coming back," she announced, setting the letter down with trembling fingers. "This is a very good sign. Gentlemen do not return unless they have made a decision or are close to making one." Camille straightened in her chair, a flicker of renewed hope crossing her face. Delphine clapped her hands together with excitement. Rosalind said nothing, but her eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the kitchen door where Alina had disappeared moments before to fetch more tea. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Lady Ashworth insisted on new dresses for all three sisters, hired additional staff to tend the gardens, and rehearsed a dozen different scenarios with her daughters, coaching them on what to say, how to walk, which paths through the garden offered the most flattering light. Alina, meanwhile, was given strict instructions to remain inside the house during the Duke's visit, to avoid the gardens entirely, and to make herself as invisible as possible. Alina agreed without argument. She told herself it was for the best. A man like Sebastian belonged with a woman like Camille or Rosalind, someone who understood the world he lived in, someone who could stand beside him at grand events without embarrassment. She had no place imagining herself in that world, and she reminded herself of this fact every time her thoughts drifted toward the memory of his voice saying her name. When the Duke arrived the following week, Alina kept to her promise. She remained inside, tending to household tasks, listening to the faint sounds of laughter and conversation drifting in from the garden through the open windows. She told herself she did not mind. She told herself this was exactly where she belonged. But as the afternoon wore on, she found herself glancing toward the window more often than she intended, catching brief glimpses of the group walking along the garden paths. She saw Camille gesturing animatedly toward the fountain, clearly explaining its history with great enthusiasm. She saw Delphine laughing loudly at something, her hand resting briefly on the Duke's arm in a gesture meant to appear accidental. She saw Rosalind walking slightly ahead of the group, her golden hair catching the sunlight in a way that seemed almost deliberately arranged. And then, near the edge of the garden, close to the rose bushes Alina tended each morning, she saw Sebastian pause. He was looking at the roses. Alina's breath caught in her throat as she watched him kneel slightly to examine one particular bush, the same bush she had carefully pruned and cared for just that morning before the family awoke. He said something to Lady Ashworth, who appeared momentarily confused before gesturing toward the house, toward the kitchen, toward Alina's small window. Alina stepped back quickly, her heart pounding. though she was fairly certain he could not have seen her from that distance. She told herself it was nothing, that a man like the Duke would naturally admire well-tended roses regardless of who cared for them. But later that evening, after the Duke had departed and the sisters had retreated to compare notes on the visit, Lady Ashworth called Elena into her private sitting room. "The Duke asked about the roses," Lady Ashworth said, her voice tight and controlled. "He asked who tended them so carefully. I told him the gardener." "Thank you," Elena said quietly, understanding immediately what Lady Ashworth wanted her to know, that her involvement had been hidden, that the truth had been carefully edited to remove her from the story entirely. "He seemed satisfied with that answer," Lady Ashworth continued, studying Elena's face with sharp, assessing eyes. "I trust it will remain that way." Elena nodded, though something inside her twisted uncomfortably at the words. She was not being asked, she was being warned. Over the following weeks, the Duke's visits became more frequent, arriving sometimes with only a day's notice, sometimes announcing himself just hours before he intended to call. Each time, Lady Ashworth scrambled to prepare her daughters, and each time, Elena was instructed to remain out of sight, hidden away in the kitchen or her small room, far from wherever the Duke and the sisters spent their time. But despite these careful arrangements, small moments kept slipping through the cracks. One afternoon, Elena was sent to deliver a message to the stable boy regarding the horses, a task that required crossing through a section of the garden she had been specifically told to avoid during the Duke's visit. She moved quickly, keeping her head down, hopping to complete the errand unnoticed. But as she rounded a hedge near the eastern path, she nearly collided directly with Sebastian, who had wandered away from the group to examine a particular tree. "Elena," he said, surprise and something warmer flickering across his face, "I did not expect to see you here." "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quickly, stepping back and lowering her eyes. "I was simply passing through on an errand. I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding," he said, his voice gentle. "I have been hopping to see you again, actually." Elena's eyes lifted, startled by the honesty in his statement. "Your Grace, I do not think that would be appropriate." "Perhaps not," he admitted, "but it is true nonetheless." They stood there for a moment, the sounds of Camille's voice and Delphine's laughter drifting faintly from somewhere beyond the hedge, close enough to remind Elena of exactly how dangerous this conversation was, yet far enough away that it felt, for just a moment, as though they existed in a world entirely separate from everyone else. "I noticed a book on the kitchen windowsill last week," Sebastian said, breaking the silence. "A collection of poetry, quite worn at the edges. I wondered if it belonged to you." Elena flushed, embarrassed that he had noticed something so personal, something she had left carelessly in a place she thought no one of importance would ever see. "It does, Your Grace. A foolish habit of mine, reading in the early mornings before my duties begin." "It is not foolish," he said firmly. "I found it rather remarkable, actually, given the demands placed upon your time." "You read the book?" she asked, surprised. "Only a few pages," he admitted, a small smile crossing his face. "I did not want to overstep, but I found myself curious about the woman who chose such particular poems to underline." Elena's cheeks burned even hotter at this admission. She had underlined certain lines that spoke to her own loneliness, her own quiet longing for a different life, thoughts she had never intended to share with anyone, let alone a Duke who had somehow discovered them through nothing more than a worn book left carelessly on a windowsill. "I should return to my errand," she said quickly, eager to escape before she revealed anything further. "The stable boy is expecting this message." "Of course," Sebastian said, stepping aside to let her pass. But as she moved by him, he added quietly, "I hope our paths cross again soon, Elena." She did not respond, hurrying away toward the stables with her heart racing and her thoughts in complete disarray. She delivered the message with trembling hands, barely registering the stable boy's reply, her mind entirely consumed by the conversation she had just had. When she returned to the house later that afternoon, she found the sisters gathered in the drawing room, discussing the visit with obvious frustration. "He kept wandering off," Rosalind complained, packing near the window. "Twice he excused himself to walk alone, claiming he wished to admire the grounds. It is most peculiar behavior for a man supposedly courting one of us." "Perhaps he simply enjoys nature," Camille offered, though her tone suggested she did not believe her own explanation. Delphine said nothing, but her eyes were sharp and calculating as she watched Alina move quietly through the room, gathering empty cups from the earlier gathering. Something about Alina's flushed cheeks and the slight tremor in her hands caught Delphine's attention, though she said nothing at the time, filing the observation away for later consideration. That night, unable to sleep, Alina found herself thinking about Sebastian's words, about the poetry book he had read, about the strange, dangerous warmth that spread through her every time she remembered the sound of his voice saying her name. She knew, with absolute certainty, that this connection could lead nowhere good. Men like Sebastian did not marry women like her. If Lady Ashworth ever discovered the extent of these small interactions, Alina would likely lose the only home she had known since childhood, cast out into a world that offered little kindness to orphaned girls without family or fortune. And yet, despite every rational argument against it, she found herself hoping, quietly and carefully, that their paths would indeed cross again soon. They did, though not in the way either of them expected. 2 weeks later, Lady Ashworth organized a large evening gathering, inviting several prominent families from the county alongside the Duke, hoping the increased social pressure and larger audience might finally push him toward a decision regarding her daughters. The house was transformed for the occasion, filled with candles, flowers, and the finest china the family owned. Every servant, including Alina, was required to assist with the extensive preparations and service throughout the evening. Alina moved through the crowded rooms all evening, carrying trays of refreshments, refilling glasses, and doing everything possible to remain unnoticed among the swirl of silk gowns and polished conversation. She caught glimpses of Sebastian throughout the night, surrounded by guests, engaged in the kind of polished small talk expected of a man in his position. He seemed, from a distance, perfectly content, laughing at appropriate moments, offering compliments to the sisters when prompted by Lady Ashworth, playing his role with practiced ease. Alina told herself this was proof enough. Whatever strange connection she had imagined between them during their brief encounters in the garden had clearly been nothing more than momentary curiosity on his part, quickly forgotten once he returned to the world he actually belonged to. But near the end of the evening, as guests began departing and the house slowly emptied, Alina found herself alone in the small pantry off the kitchen, gathering additional supplies for the final round of refreshments. She did not hear the door open behind her. "There you are," Sebastian said quietly. She spun around, startled, nearly dropping the tray in her hands. "Your Grace, forgive me, I did not hear you approach." "I have been searching for an excuse to speak with you all evening," he admitted, stepping further into the small room. "This seemed as good an opportunity as any." "This is not appropriate," Alina said, though her voice lacked the firmness she intended. "If anyone were to see us here together alone, the consequences would fall entirely upon me." "I am aware," Sebastian said, his expression suddenly serious, "and I would never wish to cause you harm or difficulty. I only wanted to ask you something, and I did not know when else I might have the chance." Alina waited, her heart pounding, uncertain what to expect. "Are you happy here?" he asked simply. The question caught her completely off guard. Nobody had ever asked her that before, not in all her years living within the Ashworth household. She opened her mouth to offer the automatic, expected response, the polite assurance that she was grateful and content. But something about the genuine concern in his eyes made the honest truth spill out instead. I do not know, she admitted quietly. I have never truly considered whether I am happy. I simply try to be useful, to cause no trouble, to remain grateful for what I have been given. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his face. You deserve more than simply being useful, Alina. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, and Alina stepped back quickly, putting distance between them just as Delphine appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with obvious suspicion. Your Grace, Delphine said, her voice carefully controlled despite the tension visible in her expression. Mother has been searching for you. The other guests are preparing to depart. Of course, Sebastian said smoothly, offering Delphine a polite nod before glancing back once toward Alina. Thank you for the assistance, Alina. The evening was most enjoyable. He departed the small pantry, leaving Alina alone with Delphine, whose expression had shifted from suspicion to something colder, more calculating. Be careful, Delphine said quietly, once Sebastian's footsteps had faded down the hallway. Whatever you imagine is happening here, it will end badly for you. Men like him do not choose women like you, and my mother will not tolerate whatever this is should she discover it. Alina said nothing, watching Delphine turn and walk away, leaving her alone in the small pantry with nothing but the lingering echo of Sebastian's question hanging in the air around her. Are you happy here? For the first time in longer than she could remember, Alina allowed herself to consider the answer honestly, and the answer frightened her more than anything Delphine's warning ever could. Lady Ashworth summoned Alina to her private study the very next morning, and the moment Alina stepped through the door, she understood that Delphine had not kept the pantry encounter to herself. Sit, Lady Ashworth said, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk. Alina obeyed, folding her hands in her lap, bracing herself for whatever was coming. My daughter tells me she found you alone with the Duke last night, Lady Ashworth began, her voice deceptively calm, the kind of calm that Alina had learned over the years to fear far more than shouting. In the pantry of all places, would you care to explain yourself? There is nothing to explain, Alina said carefully. The Duke wandered into the pantry while I was gathering supplies. We exchanged a few words. He left shortly after Delphine arrived. A few words, Lady Ashworth repeated, studying Alina's face with sharp, unforgiving eyes. And what exactly did these few words concern? Alina hesitated, unwilling to reveal the true content of their conversation, the question he had asked her, the honesty she had offered in return. He asked whether I found my duties agreeable, Lady Ashworth. Nothing more. I see. Lady Ashworth leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together as she considered her next words carefully. Alina, I have provided for you since you were 11 years old. I gave you a home when you had none, food when you would have starved, a roof when you would have frozen in the winter cold. I have never asked for gratitude beyond your service, and you have given that service faithfully, for which I am appreciative. I am grateful for everything you have done, Lady Ashworth, Alina said quietly. Then you understand why I must ask you to make me a promise, Lady Ashworth continued. You will not seek out the Duke's attention. You will not linger in rooms where he is present longer than necessary. You will not accept private conversations with him, regardless of who initiates them. Should he attempt to speak with you again, you will excuse yourself immediately and find a reason to leave his presence. Alina's chest tightened with something between fear and quiet defiance, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. And if he seeks me out despite these efforts, I cannot control the Duke's actions, Lady Ashworth. You can control your own, Lady Ashworth said sharply. And you will if you wish to remain a part of this household. Do I make myself understood? Perfectly, Alina said, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. Good. Lady Ashworth's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained cold and calculating. I do this for your own protection as much as for my daughter's futures, Alina. Whatever fleeting curiosity the Duke feels toward you now will fade the moment he chooses one of my daughters as his bride. Men of his station do not make lasting attachments to women in your position. If you allow yourself to hope otherwise, you will only bring yourself pain." Alina left the study feeling as though something inside her chest had been carefully, deliberately crushed. She understood the truth of Lady Ashworth's warning even as it wounded her. Whatever strange, unexpected connection had grown between herself and Sebastian over these past weeks could lead nowhere good. She was a servant. He was a duke. The distance between their worlds was insurmountable, regardless of how genuine his interest might seem in quiet, unguarded moments. She resolved, that very afternoon, to withdraw entirely from any situation where the Duke might be present. When Lady Ashworth announced his next visit 2 days later, Alina requested permission to spend the day assisting the housekeeper with deep cleaning tasks in the far wing of the estate, work that would keep her occupied and hidden throughout the entirety of his stay. Her plan worked mostly. She avoided the drawing room, avoided the gardens, avoided every space where she might accidentally encounter Sebastian during his visit. She heard, second-hand from the other servants, that the Duke had seemed distracted throughout the afternoon, that he had asked Lady Ashworth twice about Alina's whereabouts, receiving only vague, evasive answers each time. This pattern continued for nearly 3 weeks. Alina made herself scarce during every visit, throwing herself into whatever task kept her furthest from wherever the Duke happened to be. She told herself this was the right choice, the responsible choice, the only choice that protected both her position in the household and her own fragile heart from further complication. But avoiding him did nothing to quiet the thoughts that crept into her mind during quiet moments, late at night, when she lay awake staring at her small ceiling, remembering the way he had knelt beside her on the floor that very first day, the careful attention in his voice when he asked whether she was happy, the warmth in his eyes that seemed, impossibly, to see her as something more than simply useful. Meanwhile, the three sisters grew increasingly desperate as the weeks passed without any clear indication of the Duke's intentions. Camille abandoned her intellectual approach entirely, sensing that clever conversation alone was not securing his interest, and instead began attempting more personal, emotional conversations, hoping vulnerability might succeed where wit had failed. She spoke to him of her hopes for the future, her fears about disappointing her family, carefully constructed confessions designed to appear spontaneous and genuine. Delphine escalated her charm considerably, staging increasingly elaborate mishaps designed to require the Duke's assistance or sympathy. She twisted her ankle conveniently near him during a garden walk, requiring his arm for support back to the house. She arranged for a sudden downpour to catch them both without umbrellas, creating an intimate, breathless moment beneath a garden archway while they waited for the rain to pass. Each scheme was executed with careful precision, yet each time, the Duke remained politely attentive without ever crossing into the genuine warmth Alina had witnessed in him during their own brief encounters. Rosalind, growing increasingly frustrated with her lack of progress, abandoned subtlety altogether. She began directly asking the Duke about his intentions, pressing him for clarity regarding which sister he favored, growing visibly agitated when he offered only vague, diplomatic responses that satisfied no one. "You must have a preference by now," Rosalind said one afternoon, her frustration finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure during a private walk through the garden. "We have entertained you for weeks, Your Grace. Surely you understand the position this places our family in, the expectations that come with such prolonged attention without any indication of your true intentions." Sebastian paused, considering his response carefully. "I apologize if my visits have caused confusion or distress, Lady Rosalind. That was never my intention." "Then what is your intention?" Rosalind pressed, her voice sharper than she likely meant it to be. "Because I confess, Your Grace, I do not understand what draws you back here week after week, when you show so little genuine interest in any of us?" The honesty of her frustration seemed to catch Sebastian off guard, and for a moment, something like guilt flickered across his expression before he composed himself once more. "You deserve honesty, Lady Rosalind, more than I have offered you thus far. I have found myself distracted during these visits, drawn to someone whose presence I did not anticipate when I first accepted the invitation to your family's estate." Rosalind's breath caught, and for one hopeful moment she believed he spoke of herself. "And who might that be, Your Grace?" Sebastian hesitated, clearly recognizing the danger of the question, the impossibility of answering honestly without causing significant harm to everyone involved. "Forgive me," he said instead. "I misspoke. Perhaps we should return to the house before the light fades entirely." He offered no further explanation, and Rosalind was left standing alone in the garden, watching him walk ahead of her, a cold, sinking realization beginning to form in her mind, one she was not yet ready to fully acknowledge. That evening, unable to shake her unease, Rosalind sought out her sisters, gathering them together in Camille's room once more, just as they had done after the very first visit weeks earlier. "Something is wrong," Rosalind said, packing anxiously across the room. "He said something today, something strange. He spoke of being distracted, drawn to someone he did not anticipate." "Drawn to whom?" Camille asked, her voice tight with apprehension. "He would not say," Rosalind admitted, "but I have a terrible feeling I already know." Delphine's face went pale as the memory of that night in the pantry resurfaced, the sight of Alina and the Duke standing close together, the careful, guarded expression on Alina's face when Delphine had interrupted them. She had mentioned the incident to her mother, trusting Lady Ashworth to handle the situation appropriately, believing the matter had been resolved through whatever conversation her mother surely had with Alina afterward. "It cannot be her," Delphine said slowly, though her voice lacked conviction even as she spoke the words. "Mother spoke with her. She has kept her distance from every visit since." "Spoke with whom?" Camille asked, confusion evident on her face. She had not been present for the pantry incident, had not been informed of Lady Ashworth's private conversation with Alina. Delphine hesitated, aware that revealing this information would only add fuel to a fire already threatening to consume all of their carefully constructed plans. But the weight of the secret had become too heavy to carry alone, and eventually, reluctantly, she told her sisters everything: the pantry, the warning from their mother, Alina's careful avoidance of every subsequent visit. Camille listened in stunned silence, her mind racing back through the past weeks, replaying moments she had previously dismissed as insignificant. She remembered the Duke's eyes drifting toward the window during that very first visit, remembered his unusual interest in the roses during their garden walk, remembered small, seemingly innocent questions he had asked about the household staff during otherwise unremarkable conversations. "It has been her this entire time," Camille said quietly, the realization settling over her like a physical weight. "Every visit, every conversation, and this whole time, his attention has belonged to her." The three sisters sat in heavy silence, each grappling with the implications of this revelation in her own way. For Camille, it meant weeks of careful intellectual preparation had been entirely wasted on a man whose interest had never truly been available to capture. For Delphine, it meant her charm and warmth, qualities she had always relied upon to win favor, had proven utterly insufficient against whatever quiet, genuine quality Alina possessed instead. For Rosalind, whose beauty had never once failed to secure a man's attention before, it meant confronting an entirely unfamiliar and deeply unsettling form of rejection. "We cannot allow this to continue," Rosalind said finally, her voice hardening with resolve. "Mother has already tried to end it quietly, through private warnings and careful avoidance. If that approach has failed to fully discourage him, perhaps a more direct solution is required." "What do you propose?" Camille asked. "I do not yet know," Rosalind admitted, but I refuse to lose this opportunity to a servant girl, regardless of whatever strange fascination the Duke has developed toward her. Our family's future depends on this match. We cannot allow sentiment, however genuine it might appear, to destroy everything Mother has worked to secure. The sisters agreed, forming an uneasy alliance built entirely upon shared desperation, rather than genuine unity, each privately harboring her own resentment toward the others even as they aligned themselves against the common threat Alina now represented. Unaware of the storm gathering against her, Alina continued her careful pattern of avoidance throughout the following week, though the effort required to maintain her distance grew increasingly exhausting. She missed the small moments of genuine connection she had shared with Sebastian, the honest conversations that felt entirely different from anything else in her carefully controlled existence. But she reminded herself constantly of Lady Ashworth's warning, of the very real danger her position in the household faced should she allow herself to hope for something impossible. Then, on a quiet afternoon when Alina believed the Duke was not expected to visit, she found herself unexpectedly summoned to the drawing room to assist with unplanned refreshments. She entered cautiously, relieved to see only Lady Ashworth present, seated near the window with correspondence spread across her desk. "Alina," Lady Ashworth said without looking up, "please prepare tea. The Duke has arrived unexpectedly and requested a private conversation with me regarding certain matters. He will join us shortly." Alina's stomach dropped, but she nodded obediently, moving toward the small serving table to prepare the requested refreshments. She worked quickly, hopping to complete the task and depart before Sebastian arrived, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. The door opened just as she finished arranging the tea service, and Sebastian entered, his eyes immediately finding Alina across the room despite Lady Ashworth's presence. "Alina," he said, unable to fully mask the warmth in his voice. "Your Grace," she replied carefully, keeping her eyes lowered, aware of Lady Ashworth's sharp attention fixed upon them both. "I did not realize you would be here," he said, taking a seat across from Lady Ashworth while his eyes continued to track Alina's movements around the room. "She is merely serving refreshments," Lady Ashworth said pointedly, her tone carrying a clear warning that Alina understood immediately. Alina finished her task quickly and efficiently, preparing to excuse herself the moment propriety allowed. But as she turned to leave, Sebastian spoke again. "Alina, before you go, might I ask how the roses are faring? I have thought often of that particular garden since my last visit." The question hung in the air, deceptively simple yet carrying obvious significance given the deliberate care he had taken to acknowledge her specifically, in front of Lady Ashworth, despite every previous effort to maintain discretion. Lady Ashworth's expression tightened visibly, though she said nothing, allowing the uncomfortable silence to stretch between them. "The roses are well, Your Grace," Alina said carefully, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the room. "Thank you for asking." She excused herself quickly after that, retreating from the drawing room with her heart pounding, aware that whatever careful balance she had maintained over the past weeks had just been fundamentally disrupted by Sebastian's deliberate, public acknowledgement of their connection. Behind her, in the drawing room, Lady Ashworth set down her teacup with deliberate precision, her expression carefully composed despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Your Grace," she said slowly, "I must be direct with you given the circumstances. My family has extended considerable hospitality toward you over these past weeks, hospitality offered in good faith regarding the possibility of a match between yourself and one of my daughters. I would ask that you consider carefully the implications of showing particular attention toward household staff, attention that could create significant complications for everyone involved." Sebastian met her gaze steadily, choosing his next words with obvious care. "I understand your concern, Lady Ashworth, and I offer my sincere apologies for any discomfort my behavior may have caused. However, I must be equally direct in return. My interest in this household has evolved in ways I did not anticipate when I first accepted your invitation, and I find myself unable to continue pretending otherwise, regardless of how complicated that reality might prove for everyone involved. Lady Ashworth's face paled slightly, understanding immediately the full weight of what he was admitting, though he had carefully avoided speaking Alina's name directly. "I see," she said finally, her voice tight and controlled. "Then perhaps we should discuss precisely what you intend to do about this situation, Your Grace, before it grows any more complicated than it already has." Sebastian nodded slowly, aware that whatever conversation followed would likely determine the course of everything that came after, for himself, for the Ashworth family, and most importantly, for Alina, whose entire future now hung precariously in the balance of decisions being made without her knowledge or consent in the very room she had just quietly departed. Lady Ashworth arranged a formal dinner 3 nights later, inviting several prominent families from the county, alongside the Duke, hoping the presence of witnesses and social expectation might finally force a resolution to the increasingly uncomfortable situation her household found itself in. She had spent the days since her private conversation with Sebastian in a state of barely controlled anxiety, torn between salvaging her daughter's prospects and avoiding a scandal that could damage the family's reputation beyond repair. The evening began smoothly enough. Guests arrived in their finest attire, filling the grand dining hall with polite conversation and the soft clink of crystal glasses. Alina, along with the other household staff, moved quietly through the room, serving each course with practiced efficiency, doing everything possible to remain unnoticed despite the awareness that seemed to follow her now, an awareness she felt every time Sebastian's eyes found hers across the crowded room. Rosalind had spent the days leading up to the dinner nursing a growing resentment that had hardened into something far more dangerous than simple jealousy. She had convinced herself, through repeated private conversations with her sisters, that Alina had somehow manipulated the situation, using false modesty and calculated humility to capture the Duke's attention in ways that felt, to Rosalind, deeply unfair given everything she herself had to offer. As the dinner progressed through its many courses, conversation flowed easily around topics of politics, upcoming social events, and mutual acquaintances. Sebastian participated politely, though his attention remained noticeably divided, his eyes drifting repeatedly toward wherever Alina happened to be standing at any given moment. Several guests began to notice, exchanging curious glances and whispered comments behind carefully raised hands. It was during the dessert course that Rosalind's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. She had been watching Sebastian throughout the entire meal, cataloging every glance he directed toward Alina, every small moment of distraction that pulled his attention away from the conversation happening directly around him. By the time the final course arrived, her frustration had built to an unbearable pressure, and when Alina approached the table to refill water glasses, moving with her usual quiet efficiency, Rosalind could contain herself no longer. "Tell me, Your Grace," Rosalind said loudly, her voice cutting through the polite murmur of conversation around the table, "do you find our household staff particularly fascinating? I have noticed your attention wandering toward them quite frequently this evening." The table fell silent immediately, every guest turning toward Rosalind with startled, curious expressions. Lady Ashworth's face drained of color, her hand freezing halfway to her wine glass. "Rosalind," Lady Ashworth said sharply, a clear warning in her tone. But Rosalind, having already crossed the line she had carefully avoided for weeks, found she could not stop herself now. "No, Mother, I think it is time someone addressed this directly. We have entertained the Duke's visits for months, believing him to be considering marriage to one of us. Yet his attention, it seems, has belonged elsewhere this entire time." Rosalind, this is neither the time nor the place, Camille said quickly, attempting damage control despite her own private frustrations mirroring her sister's. Is it not? Rosalind pressed, turning her attention directly toward Elena, who stood frozen near the table, the water pitcher trembling slightly in her hands. Perhaps we should simply ask her directly. Elena, has the Duke made his interest in you known? The entire room seemed to hold its breath, every guest staring at Elena with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Elena felt her face burning, her mind racing to find some response that would not further complicate an already impossible situation. I do not know what you mean, Elena said quietly, her voice barely audible in the tense silence of the room. Do not insult us with false modesty, Rosalind snapped, her carefully maintained composure completely abandoned now. Everyone at this table has witnessed the Duke's attention toward you tonight alone. The question is not whether it exists, but why you have allowed it to continue, knowing full well the position it places our family in. Sebastian rose from his seat abruptly, his expression hardening with an anger Elena had never witnessed in him before. Lady Rosalind, I would ask that you direct your frustration toward me, if frustration must be directed anywhere. Elena has done nothing to encourage or invite my attention. Whatever interest I have developed exists entirely of my own choosing, and it is unfair to place blame upon her for circumstances she has actively tried to avoid. The room erupted into hushed whispers, guests leaning toward one another to exchange shocked commentary on the unfolding scene. Lady Ashworth appeared close to physical collapse, her carefully constructed evening dissolving into precisely the scandal she had spent months trying desperately to prevent. Your Grace, Lady Ashworth said, attempting to regain some semblance of control over the situation. Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately, away from our guests. I think privacy has served this situation poorly enough already, Sebastian said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent dining hall. I have spent months allowing propriety and expectation to dictate my actions, watching Elena be dismissed, warned, and hidden away simply because acknowledging genuine feeling proved inconvenient to everyone's careful plans. I am finished pretending otherwise. He turned toward Elena, who stood frozen near the table, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes as every guest in the room watched the scene unfold with rapt attention. Elena, Sebastian said, his voice softening considerably as he addressed her directly. I understand this is neither the time nor the place I would have chosen for this conversation. But I find I can no longer allow circumstances to dictate silence regarding something I know, with complete certainty, to be true. From the very first moment I saw you in that drawing room, pouring tea while everyone else in the room competed for my attention, I found myself drawn to something genuine and honest in a way I had never before experienced. Every conversation we have shared since has only confirmed what I felt in that first moment. Elena's breath caught, tears finally spilling over despite her best efforts to maintain composure in front of the watching guests. Your Grace, please, this is not appropriate. Perhaps not, Sebastian agreed, but I find myself no longer willing to prioritize appropriateness over honesty, particularly when that honesty concerns something as important as this. Lady Ashworth, watching her carefully constructed evening collapse entirely, finally found her voice. Your Grace, I must insist we discuss this matter privately. This behavior, however well-intentioned, is causing significant distress to my family and our guests. I understand your position, Lady Ashworth, Sebastian said, turning his attention back toward her with renewed composure. And I apologize sincerely for any distress this situation has caused you or your daughters. That was never my intention. But I cannot, in good conscience, continue allowing Elena to be treated as though her position in this household makes her feelings or her well-being somehow less significant than everyone else's. Camille, watching the scene unfold with growing understanding, finally spoke, her voice quieter than her sister's earlier outburst, but carrying its own weight of realization. "Mother, perhaps it is time we accept what has clearly been true for quite some time now. The Duke's affections were never something we could have won through preparation or performance. Continuing to fight against that reality only prolongs everyone's discomfort." Lady Ashworth turned toward her eldest daughter with an expression of betrayed disbelief, unable to comprehend how quickly her carefully constructed plans had unraveled entirely. Delphine remained silent throughout the exchange, her earlier suspicions from the pantry incident now confirmed beyond any doubt, though she found herself, unexpectedly, feeling something closer to resignation than anger. Rosalind, however, remained rigid with fury, unwilling to accept the reality unfolding before her. "This is absurd. He is a duke. She serves tea and mends linens. Whatever fleeting fascination he feels cannot possibly withstand the reality of what marriage to someone in her position would actually require, socially, politically, practically. You would be a laughingstock, Your Grace, and you would drag her into ridicule alongside you." "That may well be true," Sebastian acknowledged calmly, refusing to be baited into further conflict. "Society's judgment regarding this matter may indeed prove harsh, but I have found that genuine connection, the kind that exists without pretense or calculation, is rare enough that I am unwilling to sacrifice it simply to avoid discomfort or criticism." The dining hall remained utterly silent, guests exchanging glances that suggested this particular dinner party would become the subject of gossip throughout the county for weeks to come. Elena, overwhelmed by the sudden, public declaration and the weight of every eye fixed upon her, felt her composure finally break entirely. "Please excuse me," she said quietly, setting down the water pitcher with trembling hands before hurrying from the dining hall, unable to bear another moment beneath the scrutiny of the watching crowd. Sebastian moved to follow her immediately, but Lady Ashworth stepped into his path, her expression a complex mixture of anger, desperation, and something approaching genuine fear regarding what this scandal might mean for her family's future. "Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice pleading despite her best efforts to maintain dignity, "please, consider what you are doing. Not simply for my family's sake, but for hers as well. Society will not be kind to her, regardless of your intentions. Are you prepared for the consequences she will face, consequences far more severe than anything you yourself will experience given your position?" Sebastian paused, clearly considering the weight of her words carefully. "I have thought of little else these past weeks, Lady Ashworth. And yes, I am prepared to face those consequences alongside her, to protect her from whatever cruelty society might otherwise direct toward her alone. That is precisely why I could not continue remaining silent tonight." He excused himself from the table then, moving quickly through the dining hall toward the door Elena had disappeared through moments earlier, leaving behind a room full of stunned guests, and a family whose careful plans had crumbled entirely within the span of a single, chaotic evening. Elena had fled to the small garden behind the kitchen, the same garden where she tended her roses each morning, seeking whatever comfort familiar surroundings might offer amid the overwhelming chaos of the evening. She sat on a small stone bench near the rose bushes, tears streaming freely now that she was finally alone, her mind racing through the implications of everything that had just occurred. She heard footsteps approaching and turned, expecting perhaps Lady Ashworth coming to deliver whatever punishment awaited her for the scene that had just unfolded. Instead, she found Sebastian standing at the garden's entrance, his expression gentle despite the tension still visible in his shoulders. "May I join you?" he asked quietly. Elena hesitated, then nodded, watching as he crossed the small garden and settled onto the bench beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence despite the cool evening air surrounding them. "I am sorry," he said after a long moment of silence. "I did not intend to expose you to such humiliation. I only meant to finally speak the truth, but I handled it poorly without considering how deeply it would affect you." Everyone will know now, Alina said quietly, wiping tears from her cheeks. Every family in the county will hear about this by morning. I will be the subject of gossip and scorn for weeks, perhaps longer. I know, Sebastian said, guilt evident in his voice. And I take full responsibility for that. But I could not continue watching you be hidden away, treated as though acknowledging your worth was somehow shameful or inappropriate. You deserve far better than the position this household has placed you in. Alina turned to look at him fully for the first time since he had entered the garden, her expression a complicated mixture of fear, exhaustion, and something else entirely. Something that looked, unmistakably, like hope struggling against years of carefully maintained self-protection. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Sebastian reached out, gently taking her hand in his own, a gesture that felt far more significant than the brief accidental touch that had shattered a teacup weeks earlier. "Now, if you are willing, I would like to court you properly, publicly, without hiding or pretending. I understand this path will not be easy, that society may prove cruel, that Lady Ashworth and her daughters may never fully forgive this outcome. But I would rather face all of that honestly, alongside you, than continue living a life defined by pretense and expectation." Alina studied his face carefully, searching for any hint of uncertainty or hesitation, finding none. "This is a significant risk you are proposing, Your Grace, for both of us, but especially for yourself. Your position, your reputation, everything you have built could be affected by this decision." "I am aware," Sebastian said simply, "and I have made my choice regardless." Alina looked down at their joined hands, feeling the weight of the decision now resting squarely upon her own shoulders. Years of careful self-protection, of avoiding hope and expectation, warred against the genuine warmth spreading through her chest at his words, at the sincerity evident in every part of his expression. "I need time," she said finally. "This is not a decision I can make in a single evening, regardless of how genuine your feelings might be." "Of course," Sebastian said immediately, understanding evident in his voice. "Take whatever time you need. I will not pressure you further tonight. I simply wanted you to know the truth of my feelings, regardless of whatever decision you ultimately reach." They sat together in comfortable silence for several more minutes, the chaos of the dining hall feeling distant and unimportant compared to the quiet garden surrounding them. Eventually, Alina knew she needed to return inside, to face whatever consequences awaited her from Lady Ashworth and the sisters. But for this brief moment, she allowed herself simply to sit beside Sebastian, considering, for the first time in years, the possibility of a life beyond the narrow boundaries she had always accepted as her only option. The morning after the dinner brought exactly the kind of storm Alina had feared. Word of the scene spread through the county with astonishing speed, carried by departing guests eager to share the scandal with anyone willing to listen. By midday, Lady Ashworth had received 3 separate letters from acquaintances requesting confirmation of the rumors, each one more pointed and less discreet than the last. Lady Ashworth summoned Alina to her study once more, though this conversation carried none of the careful calculation of their previous meeting. Instead, exhaustion and barely restrained frustration colored every word. "Do you understand what you have done?" Lady Ashworth asked, her voice tight with strain. "This family's reputation, built carefully over generations, now hangs in the balance because of an infatuation between a duke and a servant girl." "I did nothing to encourage this, Lady Ashworth," Alina said, though she kept her voice respectful despite the accusation. "I followed every instruction you gave me. I avoided him at every opportunity." "And yet here we are," Lady Ashworth said, gesturing vaguely toward the pile of letters on her desk. "I must consider, Alina, whether it remains appropriate for you to continue residing in this household, given the circumstances." The threat hung in the air between them, exactly the consequence Alina had always feared most. Without this household, she had nowhere else to go, no family, no resources, nothing beyond the small collection of belongings that fit within her modest room. Before Alina could respond, a firm knock sounded at the study door, and a servant entered to announce an unexpected visitor. Lady Ashworth's expression tightened further as Sebastian's name was spoken, clearly not the morning she had anticipated after the previous night's disaster. He entered the study moments later, his expression composed and determined despite the obvious tension in the room. "Lady Ashworth, Alina, I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I felt this conversation could not wait." "Your Grace," Lady Ashworth said stiffly, "I trust you understand the difficulty your actions last evening have created for this family." "I do," Sebastian said, "and I have come this morning specifically to address that difficulty directly, rather than allowing it to continue causing harm through speculation and gossip." He turned toward Alina, his expression softening slightly despite the seriousness of the conversation. "I understand you asked for time to consider what we discussed last evening, and I intend to honor that request fully. However, I could not allow Lady Ashworth to make decisions regarding your future without addressing certain matters directly." He turned back toward Lady Ashworth. "Whatever decision Alina ultimately reaches regarding my intentions, I will ensure she is protected and provided for. Should you choose to remove her from this household due to circumstances entirely beyond her control, I will personally see to her well-being and security, regardless of what she decides regarding our future together." Lady Ashworth's expression flickered with surprise, clearly not having anticipated this level of direct intervention. "That is a generous offer, Your Grace, but hardly addresses the reputation damage already inflicted upon my daughters through this scandal." "I understand your concern," Sebastian said, "and I intend to address that as well. I will make clear, publicly and unequivocally, that Alina did nothing to encourage or solicit my attention, that whatever occurred developed entirely through my own choices and actions. I will not allow blame to be misplaced onto her, nor will I allow your daughters to suffer reputational consequences for circumstances that were never within their control either." Lady Ashworth studied him carefully, weighing his words against the practical realities of her family's situation. Finally, she nodded slowly. "That would be appreciated, Your Grace, though I confess, the damage may prove difficult to fully repair regardless of your intentions." "Perhaps," Sebastian acknowledged, "but I intend to try nonetheless." He turned once more toward Alina. "I will leave you now to consider everything we discussed. Please know that whatever decision you reach, I will respect it fully. But I hope, sincerely, that you will consider allowing me the opportunity to prove my intentions are genuine." He departed shortly after, leaving Alina and Lady Ashworth alone once more in the tense silence of the study. "Well," Lady Ashworth said finally, her voice carrying a complicated mixture of resignation and something almost approaching respect, "it seems the Duke is quite determined in his affections." "I did not ask for this, Lady Ashworth," Alina said quietly. "I know," Lady Ashworth admitted, surprising Alina with the honesty of the acknowledgement. "I have watched you these past weeks, avoiding him, protecting this household despite the personal cost to yourself. Whatever else I may think of this situation, I cannot fault your conduct throughout it." Alina remained silent, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected softening in Lady Ashworth's demeanor. "You may remain in this household," Lady Ashworth continued, "regardless of whatever decision you ultimately reach regarding the Duke. I will not punish you further for circumstances beyond your control." "Thank you," Alina said, genuine relief evident in her voice. Over the following days, Alina found herself constantly turning over Sebastian's words in her mind, weighing the genuine warmth she felt toward him against the very real risks their union would create. She spoke with the household staff, whose opinions on the matter proved surprisingly supportive, many of them having witnessed firsthand the genuine kindness Alina possessed, kindness they believed deserved recognition rather than continued obscurity. She spoke also with Camille, who sought her out privately one afternoon, her expression carrying none of the resentment Alina had expected. "I owe you an apology," Camille said, settling into a chair across from Alina in the small sitting room near the kitchen. "I spent weeks resenting you, believing you had somehow stolen something that belonged rightfully to myself or my sisters. But watching everything unfold, I have come to realize the Duke's affections were never something any of us could have won through careful preparation or performance. I never wished to cause you or your sisters pain," Alina said sincerely. "I know that now," Camille said, "and I find myself, unexpectedly, hoping things work out well for you, regardless of how complicated this situation has proven for my own family's plans." This unexpected kindness from Camille, combined with the genuine warmth she felt whenever she thought of Sebastian, gradually helped Alina find clarity regarding her decision. She still feared the judgment society would direct toward her, still worried about her ability to navigate a world so entirely different from anything she had ever known. But beneath those fears lay a growing certainty that the connection she shared with Sebastian was worth the risk, worth whatever difficulty lay ahead. One week after the disastrous dinner party, Alina sent word to Sebastian requesting a private meeting in the garden where their conversation had first turned honest weeks earlier. He arrived promptly, his expression carrying visible anxiety despite his attempts to maintain composure. "You wish to see me," he said, settling onto the familiar stone bench beside her. "I have made my decision," Alina said, her voice steady despite the nervousness churning inside her. "I am willing to allow you to court me properly, as you suggested, but I want you to understand fully what you are choosing. Society will not easily accept this. There will be difficulty, criticism, perhaps even cruelty directed toward both of us." "I understand," Sebastian said, relief and joy evident in his expression despite his attempt to remain composed. "And I choose this path regardless, gladly, because the alternative, continuing to deny genuine connection simply to avoid difficulty, seems far worse to me than any challenge we might face together." Their courtship, once formally acknowledged, proceeded through months of careful navigation through society's judgment and expectation. Sebastian remained true to his promise, publicly clarifying that Alina had never sought his attention, that his affection had developed entirely through his own choices and observations. This public clarification helped somewhat, though gossip and speculation continued circulating through the county regardless. Alina faced considerable difficulty adjusting to increased social scrutiny, learning to navigate formal gatherings and conversations that felt entirely foreign after years spent deliberately remaining unnoticed. Sebastian remained patient throughout this adjustment, never rushing her, always ensuring she felt supported rather than pressured, as she gradually grew more comfortable within the unfamiliar world she now found herself entering. The sisters, meanwhile, each processed the situation in their own way. Camille eventually found genuine happiness with a respected scholar she met through mutual academic interests, a match that suited her intellectual nature far better than the Duke ever would have. Delphine, after several months of adjustment, developed a cautious but genuine friendship with Alina, the two women finding unexpected common ground despite their vastly different circumstances. Rosalind took considerably longer to accept the outcome, her wounded pride requiring significant time to heal, though eventually even she found herself softening toward Alina, particularly after witnessing the genuine happiness that radiated from both Alina and Sebastian whenever they were together. 6 months after that chaotic dinner party, Sebastian formally proposed marriage during a quiet evening in the very garden where their connection had first deepened into something undeniable. Alina accepted, tears of genuine joy replacing the fear and uncertainty that had once dominated her thoughts regarding any future beyond her narrow, carefully controlled existence. The engagement announcement created another wave of societal discussion, though considerably less scandalous than the initial revelation months earlier. society having grown somewhat accustomed to the unusual match through the intervening months of careful, patient courtship. Lady Ashworth, despite her initial resistance, ultimately offered her blessing, recognizing that fighting against something so clearly genuine would serve no purpose beyond continued family strife. She even assisted, somewhat reluctantly, with certain wedding preparations, her practical nature unable to resist the opportunity to ensure the event reflected well upon her family's continued association with the Rexford name. The wedding itself took place on a bright autumn morning, attended by considerably more guests than anyone had anticipated given the scandal that had originally surrounded the match. Word had spread throughout the county regarding the genuine nature of Sebastian and Alina's connection, and curiosity, along with genuine goodwill from those who had come to respect Alina's quiet strength throughout the difficult months of adjustment, drew a substantial crowd to witness the ceremony. Alina stood at the front of the gathered guests, dressed not in the plain gray she had worn for years, but in a simple, elegant gown that reflected her own preferences rather than elaborate displays of wealth or status. She had insisted on this simplicity throughout the wedding preparations, wanting the day to feel authentic rather than performative, a reflection of who she genuinely was rather than an attempt to prove herself worthy of her new position. As she walked toward Sebastian, who waited with an expression of complete, unguarded joy, she caught sight of the three sisters seated among the gathered guests. Camille smiled warmly, genuine happiness evident in her expression. Delphine offered a small, encouraging nod. Even Rosalind, though her expression carried lingering traces of complicated emotion, managed a small, sincere smile as Alina passed. The ceremony proceeded simply, without unnecessary elaboration, exactly as Alina had wished. When Sebastian took her hands in his own, repeating vows that carried genuine weight rather than mere formality, Alina felt the full significance of everything that had led them to this moment, from that first accidental meeting over a shattered teacup to this final, joyful culmination of months of patient, determined love. At the celebration following the ceremony, Alina found herself standing near the same window where she had first caught Sebastian's attention months earlier, watching guests mingle and celebrate throughout the transformed drawing room. Sebastian approached, settling beside her with the easy familiarity that had grown between them throughout their courtship. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "standing exactly here pouring tea the very first time I saw you?" "I remember," Alina said, smiling at the memory. "I remember being terrified you would notice me, and equally terrified you would not." "I noticed immediately," Sebastian said, "though I confess I did not fully understand why until much later." "And now?" Alina asked. "Now," Sebastian said, taking her hand gently in his own, "I understand completely. It was never about titles or performances or careful preparation. It was simply about honesty, about genuine warmth in a room full of calculated pretense. You never tried to impress me, and that, more than anything else, is precisely what drew me to you." Alina leaned against him, watching the celebration continue around them, guests laughing and dancing throughout the transformed drawing room that had once represented the boundaries of her carefully controlled existence. Now, standing here as Sebastian's wife, she understood fully the truth of everything that had unfolded over these past months. She had spent years believing her quiet nature, her lack of title or fortune, made her invisible, unworthy of genuine attention or affection. But Sebastian had seen through the noise and performance surrounding her to recognize something: the three sisters, despite their beauty, wit, and charm, had never quite understood themselves. Genuine connection could not be manufactured through careful preparation or calculated performance. It emerged, unexpected and undeniable, from simple honesty and quiet strength, qualities Alina had possessed all along, waiting patiently for someone willing to notice them. As the evening celebration continued around them, filled with warmth and genuine joy rather than the careful calculation that had once defined every interaction within these walls, Alina finally allowed herself to fully embrace the happiness she had spent so long believing impossible. She was no longer the quiet servant hidden away in corners, avoiding attention out of fear and self-protection. She was Sebastian's wife, standing proudly beside him, having earned her place not through pretense or performance, but through the simple, powerful honesty that had drawn his genuine affection from that very first afternoon, months earlier, when a broken teacup had unknowingly set in motion the beginning of everything that followed.